Hey, Phil Steele here. Lately I've been obsessed with lens flares, especially adding artificial lens flares in Photoshop and Luminar. These photos are some examples we're going to look at in this video. We're going to see exactly how you add flares in both Photoshop and Luminar. We'll see how much control each program gives you because they're quite different. We'll see what kind of flares are available in each, and I'll even show you my secret trick for creating Photoshop-style flares in Luminar. So here we are in Photoshop, and we're going to look at how you can add lens flares like these to your photos. Now, as I mentioned, I have been obsessed lately with lens flares, and I can even remember the exact moment when this obsession started. It was when Luminar Neo came out with the ability to add layers. And I clicked on this button to add a new layer, and I saw all of these things here, these one-click overlays called flares. And below that, this category called light leaks, which also includes a bunch of things that are actually lens flares. And below that, this category called sparklers, which is also kind of a bunch of light leaks and lens flares. And I saw all these little overlays and I went crazy with them, and that's what started me down this path. But we'll come back to Luminar later. For now, let's go back to Photoshop, because Photoshop is the traditional tool for adding lens flares, and in some ways it's still the gold standard. So that's where we should start. So let me turn off the layer with my lens flare here and take this photo back to its original state so you can see how we add one of these in Photoshop. Alright, the place where you find lens flares in Photoshop is under the Filter menu, under Render Filters, Lens Flare. And you can see when it opens up this little dialog, there's a little sun source that you can drag around in here to change the size and shape and direction of the flare you're going to create. So I'm just going to apply one just to show you why you don't want to do it this way. So I'm going to apply that right on here. Now I've got a flare, but the problem is it's applied directly on my background layer, which means I can't change the opacity of it, I can't move it or reshape it or do anything with it. It's now merged into the background layer. So you never want to do that in Photoshop. I'm going to undo that. You want to create a new layer and put the flare on a layer of its own. So I'm going to go to Layer, New Layer, I'll just call it Flare, I guess Flare 3, since I already made a couple. Okay, now we have our new layer here, empty layer, and it would be nice if I could just go Filter, Render, Lens Flare, and put it right on there, but no, Photoshop won't let you render it on an empty layer, so we have to fill the layer with black. So I'll come over here, make sure black is currently selected, get the paint bucket tool, fill the layer with black. Now, filter, render, lens flare. All right, now you can see this better because it's on a black background. You can see what happens when you drag the sun source around and the way it changes the shape. You can also see the other types of lenses. That's a 50 to 300 zoom. Here's your 35 prime. Here's your 105 prime. I'm not sure what lenses they use to create these. And the movie prime, we'll talk about that later. I like the 50 to 300 zoom for this kind of thing. And I tried creating it this direction, but it sort of obliterated the girl by going right on top of her. So I think I'm going to orient it more like this direction. Well, I think it may be a little shorter. Render it on the black. And then we have to change the blend mode to screen. And if you don't understand all this stuff, just see my Photoshop Basics course. It covers all these things. All right, now we can see it. But the problem is it's not in the right place because the sun seems to be in the rock. So I kind of want to move the sun source over this direction. So I've got the move tool. I can just drag it because I've got this layer. I think I also want to rotate it. And you see another problem that's happening? See as I move it, see the edge of the frame right here? See that edge? That's because I'm moving the edge of the whole render frame with the flare on it. So we're going to have to mask that out too. But anyway, I'm going to bring it over to about here. And you can see that frame edge there. And maybe I'll even rotate it slightly. So I'm going to go to Edit, Free Transform, rotate it a little bit. So now I like my flare, but I'm going to have to mask that edge. So on this layer with the flare, we need to create a mask. Again, if you don't know how to do this stuff, just see my Photoshop Basics course. It's all in there. The mask is white. I need to have black selected to cut through it. Black is selected. B for my brush tool. Make my brush big and soft. And let's see, what's the paint opacity? 38, that's good. I'm just going to paint out the edge so you can't see the hard edge of that frame. There, and got rid of that. I think I might want to move it one more time. So I'm going to go back to free transform. Kind of, there we go. I wanted to get this. I wanted to get these a little closer to her. So that's how you do it in Photoshop. As you can see, it's not exactly simple. It involves a complex series of steps and usually involves some masking and moving things around. But you have some really cool flare options in there and the ability to control the size and shape of them, which is great. Now we'll see how you do this in Luminar. And before we get started, just a reminder, I will put links down below this video where you can get Luminar using my discount, and also links to a full Luminar course if you want to learn how to use it. So here's the original version of that photo. So let me see if I can recreate those flares Luminar style. So I'm just going to click on the Add a New Layer button and choose from these built-in flares and light leaks. I think for the first layer, I'm going to pick this one right here from the flares category. And I like what it's doing on her hair, and I like this, but I don't like this weird feathery looking part at the bottom. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate it first because I don't want the flares back here. I want them over on the girls. So it comes in automatically selected. You can see the selection handles on the corners that allow you to resize or reshape it, or with my cursor outside of it, I can drag to rotate it. So I'm going to rotate it, and I'm going to put it, I like the thing that's on her hair, so I'm just trying to figure out where I want these. I kind of like these flares on there, and I'm just going to have to mask out this feathery looking part that I don't like down there. So I'm going to hit enter, and you can see we have to hide this edge, need to mask that, the edge along there. So in the layer, I'm going to click on the mask icon. Actually, I'm going to turn it up to 100% so I can see where I'm working. Mask it, get my eraser, bring the strength down, make my brush soft, start taking out this part that I don't like at all, this feathery looking part right there, and working on this edge. I think I'll turn up the strength to save myself some time working on the edge here. I want that edge gone. And then this feathery thing right there I don't want. But I do like these. So let's see, yeah, I kind of like the strength of it up strong. So there's before and after so far. But now I want to add another layer. So I'm going to click on the Add New Layer button. I'm going to go get this one out of the light leaks category, which is really a lens flare, not a light leak. And I'm going to turn off the layer, the first layer I added, just so we can see what this one's doing. So here's the new one I just brought in. And I think I like it right where it is. And it's at 100%. I might bring it down a little just because that's a little intense down there. But I'm going to add another copy of the same layer and then offset it a little. So let's go back in. I'm going to grab another copy of that layer. And you can see it's very intense because it's right on top of the other copy. But this time I'm going to offset it a bit. And I think I'm going to stretch it a little. So I'm going to grab this corner handle. And I'm just going to stretch it until I can get, I didn't want this thing right on her. And so I'm kind of getting it over out of the way and getting this part on her hair and her face. So this is one of the cool things you can do in Photoshop too. You can stretch the overall thing if it doesn't have the proportions you want. So I'm liking the look of that. This thing's good. I'm going to tone that down slightly, but I like what it's doing on her hair and her face up there. So once again, we have the problem of the edge, and I want to take a little bit of it off of her eye there. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to mask. I'm going to get my eraser, bring the strength down. I'm going to blur this bottom edge where I don't want to see the edge of the frame. It doesn't show up here in the blown out part. And I'm going to make my brush a little bigger. Just take a little bit of the heat out of that one. Take it a little bit off her face right there. Get her eye unencumbered. So I'm going to bring back all the layers that we have going now. So there's the total before and after so far. I'm liking all these little flares, but I think I'm going to add one more layer yet. So let's go in here. In the light leaks category, I'm going to get this film burn kind of thing. And that's pretty intense at 100%. So maybe dial it back. Actually, I like it kind of intense at the bottom. So I think what I'll do is leave it intense down there and then mask some of it off of their faces. Maybe not quite that intense, but now I'm going to mask, get my eraser, bring it down, make my brush big. Just get the, especially where it's on her face, really intense right there. I want to get that out of there. And get some of it off of her too a little bit there. So there, I like the look of that. Here's my before, here's my really flared out after. And I think you can see how much easier using layers and masks is in Luminar rather than Photoshop. But Photoshop is still more powerful overall, and it has those really cool circular lens flares that we can't quite recreate in Luminar. Now, just to give you a feel for the kind of variety that Luminar has in all those built-in flares and light leaks, I'm just going to go through a series of them just to show you the kind of stuff that's in there. So first, I'm going to turn off the one that's currently turned on. This is my original photo, and I just thought this one would be fun because it's got all these light sources in the background, which is the kind of thing that might cause some lens flare in the first place. So I'm just going to flip through these one at a time to give you a feel for what's in Luminar. So there's just a little sample of the kind of stuff that's built in there. And obviously those were just single. You could stack up layers like you've seen me doing to create all kinds of effects. All right, now let's come back to Photoshop and let's compare the different styles of lens flares that Photoshop gives you. And we'll compare them on this photo because this kind of has a dark background, which it makes it very easy to see them. So this one, if you recall, this is the one called the 50 to 300 millimeter zoom style in the little Photoshop menu. Let's pop that menu back up. Render lens flare. So this is the 50 to 300 zoom. We also have a 35 millimeter prime and a 105 millimeter prime. We'll talk about movie prime later. Now let's compare these three. So I already rendered them, so you don't have to watch me go through the process. So I'm just going to turn off this layer with the 50 to 300, and I'll turn on the layer with the 35 millimeter prime. And you can see it has a bit of a different look, especially this distinctive, very full circle that it casts. Now, one thing that bugs me about this is that on this photo anyway, this circle looks too sharp to me. Its edges are too clearly defined. I like the part up here, but this thing looks weird. But you can fix that, and the easy way to fix it is you can just apply some blur to this layer with the flare on it, and it'll smooth it out. So I'm going to go under the filters. I have the layer selected that has the flare on it. Go under filters, pick blur, Gaussian blur, and then you could see it pop right in, and you just have a slider here. You can control the degree, how blurry you want it to be. You can totally blur it away or bring it back, you know, to super sharp. I kind of like it more like maybe a little less, maybe like that. Anyway, it's a matter of taste. You can decide. Okay. All right, I'm going to turn this layer off. I'm going to go turn on the one that's the 105mm prime. And once again, you can see it has a little bit different feel from the other two. And if you decide you think these little circles are too distinct down here and you want to blur them out, you just do what we just did. Blur, Gaussian blur, and boom, there you've got a softer looking set. So those are the three regular lens style flares that Photoshop offers. The movie lens style is something different. Now we're going to look at the movie lens flare option in Photoshop. What characterizes this kind of lens is this blue horizontal flare like you see coming out from the sides of the headlights. This kind of flare is created by an anamorphic lens. It's a kind of lens that's often used for making movies because it compresses the image for a widescreen format. Now, if you want to see a really extreme example of anamorphic lens flares, check out the Star Trek movies directed by J.J. Abrams. He went crazy with lens flares on those films. First, he had the coatings removed from the anamorphic lenses to make them flare even more. And then he had assistants standing outside the frame, shining lights at the lens to create all these crazy flares. I personally love the look of it, but some people complained that it was overdone, and even Abrams himself later conceded that he might have overdone it. Anyway, Photoshop gives us a type of anamorphic lens flare, which you can see I've used on this car photo. But the Photoshop flare is not really all that great, and we'll take a look and see why. Now, as always, we don't want to put it on the background layer, so I'm going to create a new layer. I'll just call it Flare 1. Now I need to fill my layer with black, and let's render a lens flare. Okay, so we want the movie prime. You can see what it gives us. It's a quirky little thing. Now since this is two headlights side by side, I'm going to try to kind of align it horizontally, but I'll have to position it more exactly in there. So I'm just going to lower the opacity before I switch it to screen blending mode. I'm going to lower the opacity to position it because I can see it better this way. I'm going to put that on the light. Now I'm just going to duplicate that layer, Command J on my Mac, and move the duplicate to the other headlight. So I've got one flare on each headlight. Now I'm going to switch both of those to screen mode, so they're blending properly. All right, so let's see. I think I need to zoom in and try to make these line up better. Yeah, because they're not lined up with each other. So I'm going to grab the second one and try to make it line up like that. All right, now they're lined up in one horizontal line, and we'll deal with these diagonal ones in a moment. But first, what I want to do, one thing that's disappointing about Photoshop's flares is the fact that it's such a thin little line, this anamorphic blue flare here. It's almost like a 1 pixel line. So I want to make it thicker, and the only way I know of to do that is I'm just going to duplicate the layer a few times and stack it up. So first I'll just go to my first one, and I'm just going to duplicate it, and then I'm going to nudge it downward. I'm going to zoom in so you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to nudge it down using the arrow key on the keyboard. See how I've got two? I'm just going to nudge it until they're slightly separated to make it look like a thicker line. And then I'm going to do it again. I'm going to duplicate that layer, nudge the duplicate layer down. See how it's thickening it up? It's like 3 lines now. And so now I'm going to go over to the other one and do the same thing. Duplicate it. I'll move it over where I can see the other one a little better. Duplicate it again, nudge it. All right, so I thickened up that horizontal line just by copying it a bunch of times and nudging each copy a few pixels away to make it look like a thicker line. But now I got the problem of all these crazy horizontal ones in here, not horizontal, but diagonal ones rather. And I think the only thing I can do is just mask those out. And so I don't want to mask every single layer that I just created. That would be crazy. So what I'm going to do is group these. I'm going to grab the first layer, grab all of them, make a group, new group from layers. I'll just let it be called group 1. So I can open it and you can see all those flares are inside, but this group has the whole stack. So I'm going to put a mask on the group level. Make sure I have black selected, get my brush. I'm going to make it totally opaque because I just want to take these darn things out, make it kind of big. And you can see already that it's causing a little problem in that it's not only taking out the, the blue flare line there, but it is also taking out some of the overspill light flare in the background. So I think the only way I can deal with that is just by go ahead and take out, I'm going to lower the opacity of my brush just a little bit to make it not quite as extreme. Take out some more of that overspray so it's not so obvious where I wiped out from the blue diagonal lines. So I got the movie flare layer there going, but it seems like it's lacking a little something, especially because I had to wipe away so much of that overflare to get rid of the diagonal ones. So I think what I'll do is just put a more traditional flare on top of it. So I need to make a new layer for that. Layer, let's see, I'll call it traditional flare. Okay, I need to fill it with black. Then we need to render a lens flare. All right, so I'm trying to think about where that headlight would be for my light source. Something about like there. Okay, let's see, I need to reduce the opacity to position it. Before I convert it to screen mode, I can see it better in this mode. Position it. Now I'm going to stretch it a little bit because it's we're going to have a problem with that edge, so I'm going to see if I can stretch it instead of masking it. I'll see if I can stretch it far enough to keep that on that headlight. Yep. Okay. So that's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to switch. I'll enter it. I'll switch to screen blending mode, and that's already looking really nice. Now I could change the opacity if I think that's too intense, or bring it up. I think that might be a bit much up at the high end, but somewhere in there. Let's see what that's doing. Might still be a bit much. So there's movie layer, and then the traditional flare overlay to spice it up. But you can probably see why I find Photoshop's movie flare a little disappointing, because it's such a thin thing. It takes a lot of work to build it up into something visible. Now, if you have any skill as a Photoshop artist, you could probably paint a better anamorphic flare instead of using this built-in one. But I'm not really a Photoshop artist, so I do it this way. All right, finally, I want to give you my special secret trick for creating Photoshop-style flares in Luminar. You know I love Luminar because it's so quick and easy, but I've been frustrated that even with all those flare styles in Luminar, I couldn't create the cool circular kind of flares like these that we can make in Photoshop. But I finally figured out a way to do it. So I started in Photoshop and I rendered each of the flares on a black background like this. And actually I made 2 copies of each. Let me go into the flares and show you what I did. So for each one, for the 50 to 300 zoom, I made 2 different copies, a medium and a large. Also for the 35 prime and the 105 prime. And the only difference was the one I called large, I had kind of stretched it out longer. And the one I called medium was sort of concentrated in the center like this. So I made 2 versions of each of those flares, and then I saved each one out of Photoshop as a PNG file. Now, I had considered doing TIFF, because I thought it might have more resolution. But when I looked at them up close, I couldn't see any difference between the TIFF and the PNG. And the PNG is about 20 times smaller. So I went ahead and saved them as PNG files. And then in Luminar, you can import those PNGs under the Layers panel. You add a new layer, and the button that says Load Image allows you to load in those images that you created in Photoshop. And that's what these are. You can see these 6 right here, 2 of each of those Photoshop style flares. So now they're just available anytime I want to add a layer in Luminar. So I'm going to click on this one, which is the medium of the 50 to 300 zoom. And it takes a minute for it to load because it's a big file. So you can see it comes in normal blend mode instead of screen mode, unlike the built-in ones. But that's fine because I want to see it well and manipulate it a little bit before I do anything. I'll turn the opacity up and you can see there is the thing that I rendered in Photoshop. So I'm going to flip it horizontally first because I want it going that direction. And I'm going to stretch it a little bit, get the sort of proportions that I want on it. And now I'm going to switch it to screen blend mode. And then I'm going to turn up the opacity so we can really see it. And now here's the before, here's the after. I have a Photoshop flare in Luminar. Don't forget, I put links down below where you can get Luminar using my discount. You can also get a full Luminar course and also my course on Photoshop basics for photographers. I hope you found this helpful, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.